Hey everybody, Chapter 13, Lesson 3, and we're taking a look at the Cold War again and how it affects American society. And the last two chapters, or two lessons, have kind of been about the origins of the Cold War and what that means for nations politically around the world. This lesson focuses much more on things here at home and how we, as kind of the average everyday American, will see the Cold War. And what's interesting about this that we need to pay attention to is that there's going to be a new Red Scare in belief in Soviet spies amongst us. And we're going to go hunting for them. We're going to go looking for them. Remember the first Red Scare, right, was after World War I, right around the summer of 1919 and 1920. And now here we are again in the late 1940s. After World War II, when the Soviets used to be an ally, but now they've become kind of an enemy of ours. Here we are with a second Red Scare as we're kind of afraid of spies and subversion in America. And I think the easiest way to kind of really understand all of this is to kind of get into the mind of this guy right here above my head. That's President Truman, and how he's going to try and deal with the reality of the Red Scare. Because what happens here is that in the late 1940s, a Soviet spy essentially defects. He comes over to the United States side from the communist side, and he brings with him a whole bunch of documents, like 100 documents, that show the USSR is actually trying to spy on our nuclear program. They want to steal our secrets. And when this hits the papers and it gets out and people start freaking out, what everyone begins wondering is not just who are the Reds, but at the same time, whether or not these people are actually trying to subvert our government, right? Trying to actually give a systematic attempt to overthrow our government using these spies inside of it. Now, President Truman, in responding to this, before it kind of becomes a Red Scare, before it gets crazy, wants to try and put people's kind of mind at ease, right? So what he does is he says, okay, well, I'm going to investigate anyone who works for the federal government, from like the lowest person on the totem pole to the most important person on the totem pole, and we're going to try and figure out their loyalty. We're going to interview them. We're going to talk to their friends and talk to their families. And he calls it a loyalty review program. And you can see that right here. This loyalty review program, it's a policy that says, you know, are you loyal to the U.S. government? And what's interesting is that, like nearly everyone is, they find a few people that they're a little suspicious of. And no one that's 100% guaranteed to be a commie. Just some people that they are kind of suspicious of. But there's no proof. And instead of kind of putting people's mind at ease, everyone says, well, then where are they? Because you wouldn't have done a loyalty review program if you didn't know there were communists, if you weren't really worried about communists, if there weren't really communists in the country right now searching for us, wanting to kill us. And that program fails to calm public fears because they found people that they were worried about. And people were wondering whether or not communists had really infiltrated the government. I mean, who were the Reds? And these investigations will continue. People will continue looking for what we can uncover and who are the bad people and who are the evil people. Our House of Representatives, for example, creates a committee called the Un-American Activities Committee, and they actually start holding public hearings and investigating people and looking into who's a commie and who's not. The FBI will wiretap thousands of Americans, kind of searching for the everyday communist among us who's subverting daily life. Even Hollywood gets investigated because people are wondering whether or not Hollywood is trying to use the movies to make us think socialism and communism is okay. And you know, the more you look for things, the more you find. I mean, the government will find some people that it suspects of being communists. One of them is a guy who works for the State Department. And remember, the State Department are the people who are in charge of how we get along with other countries. His name's Alger Hiss, and he's convicted of perjury and lying under oath. And he goes to his grave insisting that he was innocent. But we think he was probably guilty. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and this is them right above my head. That's Ethel Rosenberg. I guess I'll circle her in red. It'll be easier to see her. And this is Julius Rosenberg. They're convicted of being spies too, accused of spying for nuclear secrets. And they get sent to the electric chair. You know, we look at this, and people are like, well, how do you know? how do you find out who these people are? And what we didn't discover, in fact, we didn't know this as America until 1992. We had a top secret program going called Project Venona. And it was an effort, a part of kind of our post-World War II Red Scare. It was a part of a project whose goal was to break the Soviet spy code. And we did. We had broken part of the Soviet spy code, and it confirmed Soviet spying. Like this document right here that talks about this guy named Ailes and how he is out to get material on the bank. Well, what we discover is that Ailes is actually probably Alger Hiss, and that the bank was the U.S. State Department. So Project Venona actually helps us find information on these people that we think are spies, like Alger Hiss, and also on the Rosenbergs. You know, when we have this kind of confirmation of Soviet spying and searching for nuclear secrets, you know, people start to get really kind of upset and worried about this, and the panic of the Red Scare grows, and people even begin to be okay with kind of vague, unfounded charges. You know how like someone spreads a rumor about you and they don't really have any evidence or proof, but the rumor kind of spreads anyhow and people are buying into it? That's kind of like what McCarthyism is. We have these vague, unfounded charges. You're a commie, and she's a commie, and he's a commie. But there's no real evidence. But Americans are okay with it because they're scared, they're afraid at the time. I'll give you some examples to kind of prove the point of what we mean. One of them is even from our government. Our Congress passes something called the McCarran Act. And it was a law that said if you're a communist, you can't have a passport, you can't travel abroad. You in fact, can even be rounded up and put into camps in times of national emergency. We had camps built all across America, concentration camps ready for subversives. That's what they actually called them. They were created for subversives. When the time comes to put these commies, lock them up, lock up these political enemies of the United States. Joseph McCarthy, this guy right here, up here, whoop, that guy, he begins to hold hearings live on TV, talking about how he has proof, implying that he has proof that the Communist Party is in the United States. They're in the government. Commies are in the government. Here's part of his speech right down here. While I cannot take time to name all the men in the State Department who have been named as members of the Communist Party and members of a spy ring, I have here in my hands a list of 205 that were known to the Secretary of State. They knew about them. He goes after really, really important Americans. He goes after the Secretary of State, a guy named Dean Acheson. He goes after the most famous Army general of them all after World War II, George Marshall. He even mouths off to the president about the search for communists. And his way of hurting people's reputations with these kind of vague, unfounded charges, that's known as McCarthyism. And really, people support him all the way through this process until they catch him live on TV one day. This is a snapshot from one of his live televised hearings, going after people associated with the Army and just berating them, just brutal on TV live. And people realize that this guy's just a bully. He's nothing more than a mean-spirited bully with no evidence whatsoever. And then finally people begin to turn away from him. But even as people kind of settle down about a Red Scare regarding communists in the government, a different sort of Red Scare ends up impacting Americans, having to do with nuclear war. You see, because for a while, from 1945 to 1949, we were the only people on the planet with the bomb. And no matter whether the Soviets were in our government or not, we had the bomb. We could take it to the Soviets. Boom. Then in 1949, the Soviets had the bomb. So we start working on a bigger one, a better one that we get in 1952. It's called the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb. And it was bazillions of times more powerful than the atomic bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Americans thought, boom, we're back on top, dog. We can go after those Soviets no matter what happens. The problem is, and this was something that we hadn't seen before, the Soviets developed it 1 year after we did in 1953. And when everyone realizes the Soviets and the United States have enough nuclear bombs that can do enough devastation to destroy the entire planet, people really begin to freak out. Americans become incredibly anxious about the possibility of nuclear war with the Soviets. If you ever played a Fallout video game, this is what we're talking about, a war that legit doesn't happen in America, but in that video game does happen between communist powers, this nuclear war that happens. People prepare for all kinds of surprise attacks. Schools have these duck and cover drills that we had into the 1980s where you're like hiding under your desk on your hands and knees. I did these in early elementary school. I don't know how it's supposed to help me. Maybe I can't see the atomic bomb coming to kill me, but whatever. We had bomb shelters in my high school. Churches and public buildings and parks and all kinds of places had bomb shelters to protect you. People were worried about fallout. They were worried about radioactive material killing them. And even as these kind of fears and worries about nuclear devastation spread, we start to see it popping up everywhere. Songs talk about the war. James Bond is a Soviet, a Western spy against the Soviets. Plays, films, all kinds of popular fiction. Even up into the 1980s, we've got Cold War movies like Rocky IV, where Rocky goes up against the Soviet Union's Ivan Drago, in this big fight. And people, rightfully so, you begin to question whether we should have used the bomb at all. In 1946, a guy named John Hershey published a nonfiction book called Hiroshima. He interviewed survivors who talked about the horrors of nuclear war, who saw it firsthand, and Americans begin to wonder if it was the smart thing to do. Should we have dropped the bomb? I think the takeaway from all of this is that the late 1940s, early 1950s are full of a second Red Scare. But it's the latter part of the 1950s and all through the 1960s, 70s, and most of the 80s that we begin to really see this fear of nuclear war, that the whole world could be engulfed and gone in an instant. And we'll do some more work with all of this stuff in class together.